Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to look at the flip side from last week. So last time we took a look at a game in the Nimzo-Indian where White had his way with his opponent, where he was able to break down the opponent's blockade and crash through with his attack and win gloriously. Well, today we're going to take a look at a game that goes in the opposite direction. It's one where Black wins with the blockade and White's attacking hopes end up going nowhere. So this is the game Spassky Fischer, Game 5 from their 1972 match, and it's a game that's cut short by a blunder. But even before that, it's quite fascinating. All right, so here we have the Nimzo-Indian, and Spassky played Knight F3. So a slightly unusual move, especially at the time. Now it's much better known, but then it was fairly irregular. Spassky played E3, I believe, in Game 1, although I should check that. I'm not 100% positive about the move order, so let me see. I mean, it goes into another mainline Nimzo-Indian, but let me just double check here. Yeah, actually went into it through another strange move order. So, yeah, they both ended up with classical Rubinstein variation Nimzo-Indians, but through irregular move orders. Anyway, the usual move order we'll get to in a moment. So let's see how the game went. So Knight F3, Fischer played C5, and Spassky played E3. So normally we get here a bit differently. Also, in this position nowadays, G3 is the most common move. Okay, so E3, Knight C6, Bishop to D3, and here Fischer went for this so-called Hübner variation, which is a blockading system. So he takes on C3 and plays D6, and we'll follow up with E5 next. Now, this might seem extremely strange. Why in the world would Black play what's essentially, or what looks at first like a Samish, but a tempo down? I mean, White in the Samish plays A3, and here Black is going for it without even being prompted. Is it that the Samish is so good for Black that it's worth going into even out of tempo? Well, in fact, there's an important difference, and it's that the knight is on F3 rather than on E2. With the knight on F3, of course, the F-pawn isn't going to F3 or F4 unless the knight moves, and first of all, there's no really obviously great square for that knight on F3 to go to. And secondly, let's say it goes somewhere and then comes back to F3, or maybe kind of a ridiculous idea would be knight G1, E2. Well, in that case, White would be a tempo down in a Samish, not a tempo up. So this is not really a tempo loser at all for Black. It just leads to a different kind of position. White has saved a tempo in one place, but the knight on F3 is not nearly as well placed as it would be on E2 for a Samish kind of approach with E4, F4, and so on. Now, let me go back and discuss the move order issues a little bit. So E3 as usual, and now if Black plays C5, aiming for the Hübner system, after, for instance, Bishop D3, Knight C6, Knight F3, okay, and then takes and D6. So that gets to the position we were just at. But White can vary in a couple of ways. One is that he could go for a Samish here with A3. He might sniff the Hübner and prefer to go into it like this, or prefer to take the doubled pawns on in this way, and then Knight E2 or Knight E2 or E4. Okay, so that's the Samish approach. He can also play Knight G to E2 here. This is certainly playable as well. Leads to its own kind of position. And then finally, after C5, probably the most common move nowadays, I think, certainly at the master level, is Knight G to E2. So Bishop to D3 is still certainly very popular, but Knight G to E2 I think is maybe the more testing approach. Okay, so back to the game. So we get this Hübner system, and as I said, what Black is up to here is to create this blockade. He's going to play E5 and try to encourage White to play D5 and E4 when White has this, well, kind of a quasi-space advantage. I mean, the space advantage assumes you have more room for your pieces, but with the center all blocked up, neither side really has so much room for their pieces. So White's pawns are all further advanced, but whether this turns into something that is meaningful remains to be seen. Okay, well here White has, over the next few moves, White has several choices. In the game, it goes like this: e4, e5, d5, knight e7. And we'll come back to this shortly. All right, so here we have a locked up center. The white dark squared bishop maybe has some life, although it's hard to say exactly what its life is. I mean, it can go to g5, but then that's more or less committing to a swap after, let's say, knight to g6 and then h6. It can go to e3, but, well, it's biting on granite with that pawn on c5, which is very well defended. So the dark squared bishop looks like it has some freedom, but it's not clear how much, while the light squared bishop is not a great piece at all. So white's plan here is going to be, or at least white's most obvious plan, will involve going for f4, trying to either gain some space on the king side or crack up this black center. All right, well, we'll come back to this. First, let's look at some other approaches that white has. So one is to castle, and then black can choose between a couple of paths. On castling, we can end up with play pretty similar to the game like this, although in the game the players take a little while before they castle. Now, for instance, knight h4, preparing f4, h6, and now white can choose between moves like f4, or maybe the more restrained f3, aiming to play g4, or to play queen f3, helping to fight for the f5 square with pieces. So all of this is possible, and we'll see something like, going forward again, the position after f4 in the game. Okay, another move for black is to not castle yet, but play e5. So no rush to castle. Let's try to set up the blockade first. And now, if d5 and then e4, we get basically something a lot like the game, but white can try to be flexible with knight to d2. So leaving the center, leaving the central tension in place, black would not mind sacrificing, white would not mind necessarily sacrificing a pawn in the center because, okay, just to give an example, let's say black goes pawn grabbing here. So c takes d4, c takes d4, e takes d4, e d4, knight to d4, rook e1 check, maybe knight to e6, and now bishop to a3, or maybe the bishop goes to b2. And here, well, white's bishops are very active, very lively. White has lots of space, good prospects, certainly very good compensation here. Okay, so I don't know that black wants to play c takes d4. I believe the main move here is just to castle and await further developments to see if white maybe plays d5 now or does something else. So there are a lot of moves here for white. No really clear consensus on what's best. All right, so in the game, Spassky played e4. Okay, we already saw this. E5. And now another option. Instead of d5, white can try h3. So this is a line, it wasn't initiated by Yusupov, but I believe he developed it. Okay, black plays h6. Not so much a waiting move. You'll see the idea of this, or one idea in this line shortly. Now the main move here is bishop to e3, and lots of theory here. Black plays b6, defending the pawn. White generally plays d5 after all. Knight e7, knight to d2, and knight to g6, and so on. Okay, g3 taking away the f4 square. Black usually castles at this point. And now one idea for white is to play knight f1 and try to maneuver it to e3, and maybe from there to f5. One possibility. All right, but we won't dig into this one too much more. I want to show another line. So after h6, another popular move is castling. Now the main line from here goes like this. Castles, bishop e3, b6, d5, knight e7, king h2. And white aims to build on the king side, perhaps g4 is coming, and so on. But there was an interesting game mentioned in chesspublishing.com about 10 years ago with g5. Now this is kind of a fascinating idea. So it's taking that blockading plan to an extreme. So taking full control over f4 and maybe, just maybe even hoping for his own kingside play, which would be kind of an unusual turnabout. So there was a game it was one game with this, and after bishop to e3, I forget what was played in the game, but Wallace suggests g4, just going for it. Takes, knight takes, and then queen f6, and then on d5, knight e7, and black is better. I mean, very clearly, black black can build up a kingside attack here with ease, and white has no counterplay anywhere else. I mean, the center's closed, nothing's happening on the queen side, and meanwhile, the black queen, the knight on g4, rook coming to g8, the knight from e7 maybe goes to g6, and from there to h4 or f4, and even the bishop on c8 could easily find itself on g4 or h3 in some variations. So this does not look like a pleasant position for white at all. So this would be interesting. Anyhow, let's go to the game now. So instead of h3, Spassky played d5, knight e7. Okay, now another idea is to play, well, in the game, Spassky played knight h4. Another possibility is to play knight to d2, followed by knight f1 and then knight e3. Again, hoping to build up on the king side, maybe aiming to put a knight on g5 or on f5 at some point. Although that can happen after knight h4 as well in many cases. Okay. So knight h4 was played. Fischer played h6, and now another key moment. Here, Spassky played a move that was new at the time, f4, and it looks very, very logical, and it's a very clever move tactically. So it makes good sense strategically, or at least it seems to. It seems to follow up with white's plan of opening the king side, opening the f file, getting the bishop on c1, giving it maybe some more prospects. So we'll see this in a moment. But let's talk about some alternatives first. Okay. A move that was known at the time of the game certainly was f3. And just to give one variation from M's back in 99 or so, queen a5, bishop d2, g5. So there's that move again with the blockade. Knight f5, swaps, and then here, okay, g4 is interesting and unclear. Fixing the g5 pawn in place so white can prepare h4. Because on the immediate h4, which is what happened in a game Donner against Timman, Amsterdam 1981, black played g4. And after fg, played e4, and then e3. And here, black has full compensation for the pawn, a lot of activity. Here, white should have played bishop to d2, and then according to M's, this position is unclear. So it looks like a position that's easier for black to play, but white does have a pawn and two bishops. The bishops don't obviously mean very much right now, but it's certainly possible that they could later on. Okay, so that was f3 here instead of Spassky's f4. Another move is just the rather simple pedestrian kingside castling. Again, g5, knight h7. Okay, so again we have the swap, so you trade the knights. Bishop comes to d7, rook to b1, and this was equal in the game Viganian against Short in Horgan in 1995. All right, more contemporary approaches are g3, and that way on g5 white can put his knight on g2, which is a sensible square, followed perhaps by e3, and at some moment later on he may play knight to f5, but no rush. And ideas like h4 and f4 can also be in the air. Another possibility is h3, and on g5 knight f3, and now there's no g4 at least, and after knight to g6 you play g3. So here with the pawns on h3 and g3, white is restraining black's minor pieces. So no knights going to g4, no bishops going there, no knights going to f4 or h4. Okay, well let's get to f4 now. Alright, well what is black to do here? Either you take or you, allow the capture. If you allow the capture, well that doesn't seem so great because then white gets this protected past d5 pawn. So that seems to be unpleasant. Plus, the f-file opens either way. Well, there might seem to be a tactical problem with f4, which is e takes f4, bishop f4, and then g5. You might want to figure out why this really isn't so bad for white at all. In fact, this would be good. This is probably, however, why people hadn't played f4 up to that point. And Spassky correctly saw that this was entirely playable for white. Well, the move here for white is to play e5, and this saves the piece. He doesn't lose a piece here. Black has a lot of options, but none of them are really fantastic. I think white's better in every case. Okay, let's look at the options. Okay, if the knight goes back to d7, then this is a relatively simple line. E takes d6. Okay, black's knight has only one square. Okay, if he takes this, then queen e2, just swap everything off and castle, and white is much better. Material is even, but the f4 pawn's dropping, and all of white's pieces are active. Okay, so back here. Knight to g8 is the only move that is really principled, but after bishop to d2, takes and castles. Okay, white is sacrificing a piece here, but black's king is not going to live very long. You can see every white piece is going to be involved in the attack. Queen h5 is coming, or maybe queen e2 check and then queen h5. The a rook comes to e1, or maybe even there might be some rook f7 sacrifice as well. Rook f7, queen h5 check, rook comes to f1 or e1, or it depends on what black does, but this looks absolutely atrocious for black. White is winning here. So knight to d7 is a stinker. It's not a good move. Okay, another move is knight to g4. And most of the analysis here I did as my own, but here's a line from Timon with a mistake from his old book. So he gives e takes d6. All right, so e6 is in fact better. So after e6, white has a serious advantage. Again, the black king is in a bit of trouble. The immediate tactical point of e6 is that the knight on g4 is hanging because the bishop on c8 has been cut off from its defense. Anyway, Timon gives e takes d6, g takes f4, d takes e7, queen takes e7 check, queen e2, knight e5, and he says, well, this wins a piece. But this is not true. Actually, no, I'm sorry. E6 probably is given by Timon because, yeah, he rejects this line for this reason. So he says black wins a piece here. Now, this is not true. So see if you can figure out why this does not win a piece. Well, the answer is the white plays king to d2, and he stands better here. So it's a slight advantage, nothing huge, but white is a little bit better in this position. So the right reason to reject this variation with e takes d6 is that black plays knight e3 here, and now he does stand considerably better. So maybe there's no immediate win, but this knight is fantastic, and white probably needs to play knight to f3, and black's development is quite good. Can maybe play rook to g8, the bishop can come to g4 in some cases. Very good position for black. Okay, so knight to g4 is met by e6, not e takes d6. Okay, a couple of lines that aren't discussed in the lit, as far as I can tell, are knight f takes d5 and bishop to g4. So on this, okay, black is not winning a piece, obviously. He's sacking a piece to and then taking it back. But he's up a pawn and hoping maybe to take on e5 or d5. But after e6, white gets a nice advantage. And I mean, you can see clearly that black's king is a bit unsheltered. And after queen e1 followed by c4, black is in trouble. So finally, there's bishop to g4. And this is actually pretty good. After bishop to e2, black then plays knight h5. So another little tactical resource here. After bishop to e3, takes, and then the funny but good knight to g7 seems to keep everything together. And in this position, white is only a little bit better. So it's playable for white, certainly, but black is doing just fine as well. So e takes f4 probably isn't that bad, given this bishop to g4, knight h5 line. But still, white is a little bit better there. But Fischer found a really brilliant move. This absolutely takes care of this f4 variation and just renders it really without much bite at all. So he found this neat move, knight to g6, which is really a wonderful move. Okay, it looks crazy. Knight takes g6, f takes g6, and now f takes e5, d takes e5. Okay, and so here white has the two bishops. Black has, well, both sides have doubled pawns, but black has doubled pawns and an isolated e5 pawn, and white has a passed d pawn. What more could he want out of the opening, right? Well, in fact, it's very doubtful that white has anything in this position. And the reason is that, well, white has two bishops, yes, but there's nothing really for them to do. It's very difficult for either of them to achieve anything. The light squared bishop bites on his own pawns, Well, white's dark squared bishop bites on black's pawns. So if he goes to e3 or a3, black just plays b6. And on the diagonal it's on now, there's nothing for it to do there, and black might even play g5 and shut it down even more. The e5 pawn, it's isolated, it's true, but it's very, very difficult for white to attack it. And the passed d5 pawn isn't going anywhere. In fact, it just encourages black to blockade it with a knight on d6. So this is really of no concern to black whatsoever, these alleged weaknesses. Oh, and even the g-pawns. The double g-pawns, well, they give black the open f-file too, so white is not going to have any pressure on the f-file. Black can neutralize it in a snap. And by having double g-pawns, by having an extra g-pawn, he can play g6 to g5 and use that one kind of the way we saw the g5 advance taking place in the other variations, but here it's with an extra, it's with a spare g-pawn. So he can even keep the original at home, where it helps to keep the king side safer. So instead of f takes e5, subsequent games have seen other moves. For instance, castling right away, and then either f5, okay, and this is about equal according to Timon. It's been seen in some games too. Or queen e1. Another idea of Timon's is queen g3, and then f5. Okay, but he says this position is equal, and that seems right. Again, it's very difficult for white to muster anything positive here. h3 was played in a game between Georgadze and Gavrikov in a Yerevan zonal tournament in '82. And after queen e7, rook b1, b6, this position was equal as well. So really, white seems to have nothing special here. All right, so fe, de. Here, it would probably be better for white to play, instead of bishop to e3, to play to castle, excuse me, and then play bishop to d2. And the idea is to swing the bishop around to g3. So there's just nothing for the bishop to do on e3. So this was criticized by a number of commentators, and rightly. So it looks very natural. It looks like you're developing with tempo. What could be better? But after b6, there's really nothing. Okay, castles, and a4. And again, it's a remarkable game because it looks like Spassky just keeps making all these natural moves, and they keep proving to be bad, or at least counterproductive. They get him nowhere. Okay, well, how should Fischer deal with the threat of a4, a5, this minority attack plan by Spassky? Well, the answer is this. He just plays a5. And Fischer correctly realizes that white's a pawn is weaker than black's b6 pawn. And the reason, there are a number of reasons, but I would say that the simplest way of putting it is that it's more natural for black to defend the b6 pawn than for white to defend the a4 pawn. In other words, white can only attack the b pawn by piling up heavy pieces on the b file. And that's not really where most of the action is going to be. So white has to keep an eye on the king side to be sure. And at any rate, it's very easy for black to defend. So he just puts a rook on b8. He could put a knight on d7 if he has to. His queen on d8 defends it. Would defend it on d6 as well. So it's not really a problem. The a4 pawn, though, let's say black plays bishop to d7, maybe queen e8 at some point. White has to keep pieces looking on this far side of the board away from the action. While a bishop on d7 is quite well placed. I mean, it's covering both diagonals on both sides of the board. And a queen on e8 can jump to g6 or h5 after the g-pawn moves. So it's much more natural, much simpler, much more economical even, for black to make moves that defend the b-pawn and attack the a-pawn than for white to do the converse. Okay, so white played rook to b1, Fischer played bishop to d7, rook to b2, rook to b8, and now Spassky played rook b to f2. This was also criticized. So Gligorich, for example, thinks that it would be better to play bishop to c2 and then follow it up with queen to b1. It's, again, not a terribly active approach, to put it mildly, but he seems to think, and commentators, or at least a number of the commentators seem to agree, that white should really try to tie black down as much as possible to this b pawn, not because there's a snowball's chance of winning this guy, but just because black could have prospects on the king side. Black has more promising possibilities on the king side than white, so if he can keep black tied down a little bit, it might be for the best. Okay, well in the game, as I said, it was rook b to f2, queen to e7, bishop to c2, g5. So there's that move as mentioned, further restricting this bishop. And now Spassky plays bishop to d2, which is in effect an admission of failure. Of course, there's also knight to g4 worries, but really the point is to bring this bishop back to e1 and maybe at some point bring it to g3, or in some cases prepare h4. Okay, well now Fischer makes a nice move. He plays queen to e8, not just targeting the a4 pawn, which is defended already as much as it's going to need to be, and there's no way for black to attack it a third time, but the second point is to play queen to g6, taking aim at another white weakness. So you can see, I mean, the problem for white is that he's got no positive plans here. His bishops are terrible, and he's got at least 3 weak pawns. So the pawns on e4, c4, and a4. So none of these guys is, well, I mean, all 3 of these are vulnerable. They can all be defended. There's no clear win for black, but what is clear is that the only winning chances belong to black, and that white is destined for a life of long-lasting misery. Okay, well, Spassky played queen to d3. Fischer played knight to h5, aiming to put the knight on f4, or at least to extract some concessions out of white if he wants to prevent this. Okay, well, Spassky swapped off all the rooks, played bishop to d1. So it's kind of amusing. I mean, white has the bishop here, and look where they are. They're on the edge of the board. Okay, Fischer played knight to f4, and now where should the white queen retreat? So you might want to take a couple of seconds and decide between queen to c2 and queen to b1. Okay, well, let's say white plays queen to c2. What now? Well, unfortunately for Spassky, this is the move chosen in the game, and it resulted in a very short game. Fischer played bishop takes a4, and Spassky had to resign. The bad news is that after queen takes a4, which is the only move that makes any sense at all here, then queen takes e4 has a crushing double attack, threatening queen takes e1 mate and queen takes g2 mate. And the only thing that resembles a defense for a moment is king to f2, but then knight to d3 check forces mate. So if the king goes to the back rank, queen takes e1 is mate, and on king to g3, then there's an elegant mate in 3, like this, that, and finally knight to c1. Okay, so clearly queen to c2 is not the move. Well, what about queen to b1? Now this is, I would say, maybe the big mystery of the game here. If you look at almost any set of annotations to this game, you'll see lots of white moves criticized. So we mentioned a bunch of them already, really. So some people don't like the basic plan that he chose of locking the board up. Okay, f4 has been criticized as dubious by various commentators. Bishop to e3 is criticized here. a4 is criticized. Okay, rook b to f2 has been criticized. All right, so all of this scorn, and Fischer gets exclamation points for all kinds of moves, like when he played knight to g6, allowing the doubled pawns, and a5 in response to a4, and so on. And then they come here and have queen to b1, and they say it's unclear. I mean, certainly black has the chances, but whatever chances there are, but it's not really clear how serious these chances even are. So it's kind of that itself is kind of a funny aspect of this game, that white's position looks terrible. Black has more space, fewer weaknesses, and absolutely nothing to worry about. But can he really do anything here? Well, about the only useful comment I've seen on this is Timon's suggestion that black should start with g4 to prevent white from playing g4, and then bring the king over to c7. And but he doesn't know either, and he doesn't at all examine the position to see if there's any way for black to win. So I'll try to fill in a gap here in the chess literature, at least a gap as far as I can tell. So I mean, I don't have anything approaching everything written on the match, but I've got 4 or 5 different sources on it, and no one tries to analyze this position at all. They just say, black has chances, white has to suffer, but they leave it at that. So let me at least take a start at this. I'm sure there are going to be improvements, but we'll look at some plans. Okay, so let's say white just marks time, plays this to prevent the king from running over there. So bishop c8. Okay, so this would be a representative line where black has gotten his king to c7. Okay, so now what does he do? Okay, so from here, I come up with 2 different approaches. So the first approach is with knight to d3, and this leads to an exchange of this bishop for black's knight. All right, now white has this passed d pawn, but it's not going anywhere. Again, it's just going to sit in place, and the question is really whether black can break through. Okay, if queen f1, I mean, this looks like a kind of active move, but it's just bad. Queen g5, let's say he checks, and black gets out of the checks in a move or two with king a7 and bishop to b7. Meanwhile, white has to worry about his back rank, and neither h3 nor g3 fixes that, and all of those weak pawns are ripe for the plucking now. So this is bad. So white should play queen to e3. Okay, g3, h3, queen g5, and now we have a very interesting situation. Let's say white trades queens. Okay, takes, and here white should rush in with his king. Should go to g1. If he makes some waiting move like this, he loses because g4 comes in, and then the black bishop enters the game, threatening to go to d1. And if bishop to b3, then bishop to e2 is going to win as well, followed by bishop to d3. So king f1, bishop to d1. So bishop a2 is no good, sorry. So king g1's forced. Here, 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 here. And white is almost in Zugzwang here. He can't play king to g1 because, well, actually, let me see. Maybe he can play king to g1. Yeah, he can play king to g1, I think, but he can't go any further. So he can only go to e1, f1, and g1 at most. He can't go to d2 because then there's bishop takes h3 and g2. And if he goes to h1, we already saw that there can be problems there too. So let's see what happens. And now here, g4 I think wins, but okay, we can delay it by a move. And now g4. And I believe black wins this ending. After h takes g4, black should be very accurate here. King to g6. This actually wins. So king f1, now king to g5, bishop to e8. Okay, if d6, then black's king comes back. You'll grab the pawns and win. Okay, so king f1, now king f4. Okay, here if bishop to f3, then we take on a4 and win, or you can even play h3 and win. So king e1, bishop to g6. Okay, if this, then check. If bishop e2, then bishop c2, and we take on a4. And if king h1, then e4 and g3, and it's a win. So that's one line. Okay, going back to here, that was h takes g4. If bishop g4, then bishop a4, and this is going to win eventually too. Okay, now if white just waits around with the king, then this wins. Can't take obviously because of a2, and now bishop to c2, and we just run him. Well, we don't quite run him out of moves, but there's definitely some problems here. Actually, yeah, we do run him out of moves because this is another fatal Zugzwang. If the king goes to d2, bishop f3 wins. If bishop to b1, then bishop to b3 wins. Okay, if bishop to f3, then a4, and now the black king comes in. And there's this little shot. But what can white do? If he moves the bishop, he hangs the e4 pawn. So d6, he just takes, and then we end up in a queen ending, but this is winning for black. Okay, a3 threatens mate on b2. and black is going to win. I mean, white's pawns are all disappearing, and there's no perpetual check. All right, so that's, I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that in this position, if white trades queens, he loses. Unfortunately, after queen to e1, I don't see any win. The queen is just unbelievable here. There's no entry for the black queen. I mean, you can play queen f4, but king g1. So we cover f2. And now after, let's say, king to d6, white has only one move in this position. Okay, he can't move his queen anywhere because he'll either allow queen to c1 or queen to e3 or queen to f2. And his bishop can only go to a2, otherwise it drops the c4 pawn. But despite being so tied down, I don't see any way for black to make any further progress. I mean, we can try something like this, but now he just goes back and forth on c2 and b1 or d3, and I don't see it. So I think this draws. However, going way, way, way back to here. Okay, so last thing we looked at was knight d3, and then g5, takes, takes, and so on. Right, so this is where we were. Okay, instead, g5, and now let's say queen to e8. So this line is not so forcing. I mean, I'm really not positive about it, but again, just to at least give an indication of some of black's possibilities. Okay, queen g6, threatening the e4 pawn, h5, h4. Okay, white doesn't really want to take this knight and allow g takes f4. I mean, that lets these pawns become very mobile. That's pretty questionable. Maybe even e takes f4 as long as black can blockade on e5, although I'm not sure that he can here. Anyway, bishop to e1, knight h5, queen e2, g3, takes, takes, and maybe this position can be won by black. Again, it's very murky, but I'll show you my main line. And remember, it's a very long line, so Larsen's dictum, long line, wrong line, is quite likely to be true. Okay, g4. Now, if queen takes g3, queen takes e4 is progress for black. So bishop c2, queen g5, queen g3, bishop c4, bishop d1, hitting the g4 pawn. Now bishop to a6. All right, if bishop takes g4, then bishop c8 wins the piece. So queen g4, takes, takes, bishop d3. Now, bear in mind, white doesn't have to take this pawn. And, okay, black will play maybe bishop c8, bishop to d7, maybe play b5 at some point to create a passer. All right, all this certainly needs lots more analysis. But let's just see what happens if white takes. Okay, so bishop to d3. Now, if bishop to d1 to protect the a4 pawn, then black should play c4, not allowing white to play c4 after bishop takes e4. Got that? Okay, so black wants to take and doesn't want to allow c4. So that's the point. Okay, so bishop to f3, bishop c2, g4, takes, king f2, bishop e8, a4. All right, and so the difference is that white has two passed pawns, but they're not connected, so they're much more easily blockaded. Also, white has a bunch of pawns on light squares, which still makes them targets, and black is going to have connected passers on the outside here. So altogether, it's possibly enough for a win. Okay, and so it might look as if white should hold, but he can't, and there's a neat line. Takes, takes, bishop f1, king f7, bishop c4, bishop to a4 check. Okay, so if the king just goes back, then black plays king g6, takes on g5, king f4, and starts collecting things. Alright, so king to d3, this is the fun line, bishop to b5. Okay, if white takes, then a2 and the queen, or the a-pawn queens. So d6 check, check, a2, okay, white plays g6, and in this position, black is probably winning. Okay, I don't believe that there's a perpetual check here, and with white's king very poorly located, and the possibility of black picking up the e-pawn, although you always want to be careful about that. Sometimes picking up these pawns increases the opponent's chances for perpetual, but I'm pretty sure this is a win. So this is by no means a forcing line, but this at least hopefully gives some broad idea of the possibilities that black has in the position. All right, so this endgame is kind of a lecture all to itself, but certainly Fischer's ingenious play in this opening is very much worthy of attention, especially for a Nimzo-Indian player. So that, I hope, is what really catches your eye. So last time, again, we saw that White will, on occasion, break through these blockades and win in just spectacular fashion, but just as often, or almost as often, the blockade proves incredibly powerful as well, keeps White restrained, and these long-term problems that White has, these weak pawns, these bad bishops, often end up coming home to roost against him as well. All right, so hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Thank you, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.